Hi everyone, welcome and thanks for coming. My name's Nuala. I'm going to be talking about the climate and ecological crisis that we find ourselves in, and then I'm going to be inviting you to be part of doing something about it. I'm going to speak for about 45 minutes and then there'll be some time for questions after that. Emergency exit's just out that door. I think it's the same door you came in, and there's a toilet just opposite if you need it. The subject matter of this talk is pretty heavy, so if there's anything you need physically or emotionally, that's fine, just let me know. And we're going to, in a minute, just say hello to each other in like pairs or threes, whatever works. And I'm going to ask you to turn to the person next to you, and I'm going to ask you to tell them what you care most deeply about in the world. And it's a bit of a strange question, and it might feel kind of personal. But a lot of what we're going to be talking about this evening is breaking out of our comfort zone. So in a way, it's a bit of practice for that. And whatever it is you talk about, say a bit about it. If it's a person, maybe say their name. I'll give you 6 minutes and I'll kind of let you know when to switch over so each person gets a chance to speak. And I'll assume we're in twos or threes, so I'll tell you when 2 minutes have gone and when 3 minutes have gone. So if you want to kind of find someone near you, and just share that. What is it you really care deeply about in the world? What means the most to you? Yeah, we're going to do that now. Yeah. So if you're in a three, you might want to switch to the next person now. And if there's two of you, you might want to switch now. And if you're in a three, just make sure the last person gets a chance to speak now. Okay, let's come back together. Let's come back. So I'm just going to briefly introduce myself now and say a bit about what brought me to this point, and then we'll get on with the rest of the talk. But this is not what I planned to do with my life. I wouldn't call myself an environmentalist. I've never thought of myself as an activist. I studied Chinese at university and I wanted to be a journalist and write about China. But actually, more than anything, I wanted to feel successful, because being what I saw as a failure terrified me. And I thought if I managed to succeed, whatever it is that means, I would feel okay about myself. And I worked really hard at that in my 20s, and it took everything I had to battle against my self-doubt to try and make it as a journalist. And in 2018, I was just starting to get somewhere. I was starting to get published in respected outlets and build a network of contacts in Beijing. But at the same time, it was becoming more and more clear that we were in a climate emergency. And a family friend of mine who's kind of clued up on these things said to me that the next few years would be absolutely critical for whether humanity could turn this crisis around. And at that point, I was about to turn 30. I didn't have kids, I didn't have a mortgage. There was nothing stopping me taking this on. And it felt like we were in a historical moment in a way, and I had to decide who I wanted to be and like what role I wanted to play. And it just didn't feel right to keep pursuing my own career in the hope that one day I'd feel like I'd made it in some way. And that was around the same time that Extinction Rebellion launched in 2018. And slowly, over the course of a few months, I went from knowing that I wanted to be involved with this thing to deciding that the fight to turn this crisis around is basically what my life would be about. So over the last few years, lots of my friends have started to have children, started families, and their kids are some of the people that I care most about. And I've known a lot of them since they were born. And they'll grow up over the next couple of decades, and they'll go through the incredible process of getting to know the world and getting to know themselves in it. And they'll imagine their futures, what job they'll have, where they'll live, who they'll fall in love with, whether they'll have children themselves. So for me, those are some of the people that are in my mind when I think about this. So I'm going to speak now about the crisis we're in and what that actually means for our lives and our society. And this is important information, so you might see me reading from my notes a bit, and it's just because it matters and I want to get it right. So right now across the world, we're experiencing unprecedented extreme weather. We're seeing fire, flood and drought, forced migration, and the collapse of biodiversity. The last 7 years have been the hottest since records began. This warming is the result of historical emissions, especially over the last few decades, and we're going to feel the effects of today's greenhouse gas emissions over the coming decades. We need to bear in mind that since 1990, the total quantity of global emissions has more than doubled since 1990. Even if we stop burning fossil fuels tomorrow, the ice will keep melting, the deserts will expand, the sea levels will rise, and crops will fail. The release of large amounts of CO2 and other greenhouse gases causes a cycle of warming. So once it's set in motion, it doesn't just stop when we stop burning fossil fuels. The last time there was this amount of CO2 in the atmosphere was 3 million years ago. And when that was the case, sea levels were 50 feet higher than they are today. And the reason they're still at the level they are today is because it takes time for CO2 in the atmosphere to take effect. So scientists have known for much longer, but it was around 1990 that politicians and the public became aware of how bad things were looking. So this is really important that we reflect on the fact that emissions have more than doubled since we knew that they had to stop. Year after year, conference after conference, promise after promise, emissions increase. And this actually is what is most scary, not the physics or the natural processes, but our collective inaction. Our capacity to be fully aware of something so awful and not only do nothing about it, but make things progressively worse. And scientists are naturally cautious of making definite predictions, but there are new reports coming out all the time and they're becoming more and more stark. They're all pointing in the same direction. The Chatham House risk assessment from last September gives a good overview, and it describes the likelihood and impact of massive simultaneous crop failures. And that's right as population and demand for food increases. So crop failures caused by climate change have started already, but we, living in a rich country, don't feel them because we simply buy the same crop from a different place. And the globalised economy hides the effects of crisis from rich consumers so they can go on consuming. But we will feel the effects as crop failures get worse. And everyone will feel them when important crops fail at the same time. It only takes very small changes in weather conditions to have devastating effects. So the Chatham House report says that we have a less than 5% chance of keeping warming below 2 degrees. And that's if governments meet all of their existing targets, which they almost certainly won't do unless they're forced to. The Met Office says 2 degrees means potentially deadly heat stress for 1 billion people. 2 degrees of warming means a global average of 2 degrees, but in specific areas this could mean 5 to 10 degree increases at any given time. So, extreme heat waves. At the moment, 3 degrees of global warming seems much more likely, which means the loss of pretty much all coastal cities. I'll just say that again. The course we're on means the loss of almost all coastal cities. That's hundreds of millions of people's homes gone. 3 degrees means Europe suffering from both constant droughts and floods. Here in the UK, we import most of our food. Bring in the food, keep the migrants out. That's the plan for now. and it's heartbreaking that this is being done in our names. What the media call migrants are human beings, many forced to flee their homes because of what we've done. How much more hostile will our hostile environment get? What will it take to enforce? Can you imagine soldiers on the beaches? Because I can. There are already fences going up on the borders of Europe. This is happening now. We know that the warmer it gets, the warmer it gets. There are many examples of how this works. As the planet warms, more water evaporates into the atmosphere and acts like greenhouse gases, trapping heat and increasing the warming. We've quite likely already passed several irreversible tipping points in the climate already. For decades, satellite images have shown the sea ice retreating in the Arctic. And this process has been set in motion now, and it won't stop. White ice reflects the heat from the sun, so as it melts, the dark blue ocean absorbs the heat. Forests absorb carbon from the atmosphere, but now as they're being cut down or burned, they're emitting it. And there's talk about planting more trees, but what actually is happening is an area the size of London is lost every week. And that's roughly an area the size of the UK every year. I'm going to read a short quote from the Chatham House report I mentioned earlier. Unless NDCs, which means national climate commitments basically, are dramatically increased and policy and delivery mechanisms are commensurately revised, many of the impacts described in this research paper are likely to be locked in by 2040, becoming so severe that they go beyond the limits of what nations can adapt to. So I want to ask, do you think that governments around the world are going to dramatically increase their commitments? You don't need to put up your hand or answer, but just please answer that question in your head. It's really important that we actually engage with and answer these questions for ourselves. Do you think that governments are even going to keep to their existing commitments? Yes or no? Even if they do, the evidence says we have less than a 5% chance of keeping below 2 degrees, and that means billions of people being forced to move. Unless targets are dramatically increased and policies actually implemented, it means the likelihood of impacts being so severe they go beyond the limits of what nations can adapt to. What do you think that means? What happens when we go beyond the limits of what a nation can adapt to? As things get worse, do you think a stable world order will prevail? Democracies around the world are looking increasingly fragile. Nationalism, extreme opinions becoming mainstream, mass rejection of truth in favour of conspiracy theories and lies. We're already experiencing a global displacement crisis, around 80 million people forced to leave their homes. But think about what that means for those individual people. Think about what it means for everybody when those millions become billions. It means the collapse of already fragile political systems. It means famine and war. And it's too easy to think about words like war and famine as just words, things that happen in history books or on the other side of the world. And I think we have to do something really difficult, which is to imagine that these things could happen to us and to the people we care about without becoming completely frozen by fear. It's already happening to millions of people, and at the moment it is what our future looks like. That is the trajectory we're on. This is what my friends' children's futures look like. I'll be 52 in 2040. They'll be in their 20s. So what about you? What about the people that you care about, that you love? So I want to take a moment just to think about those people or places or things that we talked about earlier when we were sharing. Just pause for a few seconds. I really appreciate people being here and being up for hearing this. It isn't easy. So we're going to go now into pairs or threes and just say a bit about how you're feeling, and don't need to overthink it, just whatever's in your head. We'll take like a minute each, so a total of 3 minutes, and I'll let you know when to switch. So if there's 3 of you, move to the next person now. And if there's 2 of you, just make sure the other person gets to speak now. If you're a 3, make sure the last person gets to speak now. Okay, let's come back now. So now we need to talk a bit about denial. I often don't know what to say when my friends who don't have children yet want to talk to me about their plans to start a family. And it's not that I think people shouldn't have children because we're in a climate crisis. It's just that they're planning families like the ones they grew up in, and planning lives like the lives that they had as young people. And I just don't think it's going to be like that. And a lot is uncertain about how this crisis will unfold. But I think one thing we can be pretty confident of is that daily life isn't going to look the same as when any of us in this room were children. For one thing, if you were born before the 90s, the weather you grew up with is gone. either forever or for a very long time. It's permanently changed. And I know my best friend would love for us to have children at the same time. And I really do understand this reality we're living in is pretty hard to take in, and the world's still carrying on as normal, so why shouldn't she? But at the same time, it completely breaks my heart to know that at some point it isn't going to be possible to stay in denial, that the reality is going to become impossible to ignore, and at that point she might find herself coming to terms with the crisis at the same time as having a young family, being a mum for the first time. So on our current trajectory, we have less than a 5% chance of avoiding societal collapse. This is denial, right? We choose not to look at the evidence, and we tell ourselves stories to make us feel better about what we do. We have to accept too that market solutions or individual lifestyle changes are also fantasies to make us feel better. Signing petitions, going on marches, doing the recycling, offsetting air miles, buying electric cars. Well-meaning people do these things every day, and it makes no difference to our collective direction of travel. In fact, the situation gets worse because we tell ourselves we've done our bit. And there's a lot of explanations for this kind of denial. We all have our priorities: family, career, investments, religion, politics, retirement plans, passions, resentments, or just getting by in difficult circumstances. And our individual priorities understandably loom large in our consciousness, and they shut out other things. As individuals, we all have our reasons not to take the kind of action that's now necessary. But we also all have the duty to do something in the face of the crisis. To be living in the UK in the 3 to 4 years we have left to avoid societal collapse is already an immense privilege. There's nothing wrong with privilege as long as you do something with it. People around the world are dying right now because the Western world's obsessed with fossil fuels. And activists around the world are being murdered for protecting rivers and mountains from extraction. And I'm not here asking you to give up your life or your privileges, though people have done that for much less. But I'm asking you to look at your life honestly and decide what you'll do with the time you have now to ensure there's at least a chance of a livable planet for the next generation. I'm asking you to push your comfort zones, whether that means by knocking on your neighbour's door, speaking to a room full of strangers, or breaking the law and risking arrest. We must all be prepared to go further now. I know I don't want to find myself in years to come wishing I could give everything to return to this moment and make different choices. So according to Oxfam, the richest 1% globally have been responsible for twice as much CO2 over the last 25 years as the poorest 50%. So this is very much a crisis caused by the rich and inflicted first and hardest on the poor. This is a crisis driven by profit. Corporations are legally obliged to maximise their profit for shareholders. It's a contractual obligation. When what are considered environmental concerns clash with economic concerns, the money wins every time. Those people with the capacity to change, those with money and power, but they are the ones with the capacity to make the changes that have a big impact, but their wealth and power comes from the system that's causing the crisis. And the system oppresses those without money and power, so they feel understandably less able to take action. So is this a law of human nature that those who don't have power can't make change and those who do have power don't? I think what we're proposing today is that it's not that inevitable. All over the world and throughout history, transformative change has been made by individuals and small groups of people who are willing to do what was necessary. And it begins by having the courage really to see things as the way they are, and then making the choice to do something about it. I'm going to read a quote now from Martin Luther King. It's quite direct. But before I do it, I just want you to bring to mind that person or place or thing that you shared at the start, what you care about most. If you have never found something so dear and so precious to you that you will die for it, then you aren't fit to live. You may be 38 years old, as I happen to be, and one day some great opportunity stands before you and calls upon you to stand up for some great principle, some great issue, some great cause. And you refuse to do it because you are afraid. You refuse to do it because you want to live longer. You're afraid that you'll lose your job, or you're afraid that you'll be criticised, and so you refuse to take the stand. Well, you may go on and live until you're 90, but you're just as dead at 38 as you would be at 90. You died when you refused to stand up for right. You died when you refused to stand up for truth. You died when you refused to stand up for justice. Our government is fully aware of the evidence and what it's telling us, but they're interested in power, the protection of their privilege, and the interests of their friends. It's an outrage and it's criminal. They have huge amounts of power given to them by us, and they refuse to do what is necessary to protect ordinary people. And that means the social contract between citizens and the government is broken. Their most basic duty is to protect their subjects. So our only choice now is to force the government to take responsibility. If you have any idea how bad our future looks, then you only have two choices: to lie to yourself or to take what you consider meaningful action. And this sounds blunt and kind of rude, and a few years ago I wouldn't have been able to stand up in front of you and say it, and I don't in any way say it lightly to you today. But it is true. And this is foundational to everything we do. The truth is often not what people want to hear, but we have to say it. In the 1930s, there was all the signs that war was coming, but most people didn't want to rock the boat, desperately hoping that what was obvious was not true. Just pause for a minute now before moving on to the second half of the talk, which is quite different. So, if we accept the reality of what's unfolding, then we need to do something about it. And we need a plan. And that's what we're offering to you today. Extinction Rebellion is drawn on movements around the world and throughout history to design our strategy, which is based on basically one essential factor: disruption. And this is crucial. If a protest isn't disruptive, it can be ignored. And everyone is desperate to ignore this crisis for very understandable reasons. For this reason, the disruption we cause needs to impact the public. The government itself and big corporations are far more resilient to disruption. They'll proactively ignore it and even attempt to cover up disruption that might require them to do things differently. It's through public opinion that those institutions feel pressure. So we can put direct pressure on the state by creating dilemmas. These involve causing public or economic disruption, and the state has to respond, or else eventually it looks weak. The response will either be to negotiate and engage with our demands, or to clamp down. And clamping down exposes them as willing to enact violence on, imprison and punish their own citizens, rather than act on a climate crisis they acknowledge is here. So our aim is to put pressure on the state by causing disruption that cannot be ignored, to the point that they're forced to engage with our demands. And this works. It is actually already working. So in 2019, we staged our first major mass participation action in London, around 10,000 people on the streets of central London for less than 2 weeks. And that led to the UK becoming the first parliament in the world to declare a climate emergency. We became one of the most recognised protest movements in the UK, and the model was adopted in over 70 countries around the world. I think we're on every continent now. Most recently, a group started in Antarctica. But real concrete change still isn't being made by those in power. We know disruption works. History tells us it works. We've probably all heard of the suffragettes. Why have we heard of them? Because they caused disruption and it worked. We've heard of Martin Luther King because he caused the civil rights movement, caused disruption, and it transformed race relations in the US. So now we need to cause more disruption with more people, and we need to do it now. Sir David King, who's the former chief scientific advisor to the government, said that he believes what we do in the next 3 to 4 years will determine the fate of humanity. This means 3 to 4 years for the world to dramatically change course, otherwise we're headed for social collapse. Getting Parliament to declare emergency was just the first hurdle. What we have to do now is to get them to actually do something. And we know we're on the right track because the government is responding to us in a more heavy-handed way now. There's a famous Gandhi quote that says, "First they ignore you, then they laugh at you, then they fight you, then you win." So we've been ignored and laughed at. The Prime Minister and the press have made their jokes about uncooperative crusties. But now they're fighting us. 9 peaceful climate activists have just been released after 2 months in prison in the UK. The government's currently pushing through a new bill called the Police Crimes Sentencing Courts Bill. There's a lot in it, much of it a direct response to XR and Black Lives Matter protests. Gives the Home Secretary the discretion to decide what should and shouldn't be allowed. It's a racist assault on minority groups, and it's an attack on human rights and freedom of expression through assembly and protest. It's profoundly anti-democratic, but it's also evidence that the government is reacting to our challenge. And this is a really important point. We don't need to be popular. Pursuing popularity is what our political parties do, and it requires them to compromise their principles, to be dishonest and to pander to what they perceive to be public opinion. In fact, being willing to be unpopular is essential. Not wanting to be unpopular, not deliberately doing things that will make you unpopular, but being willing to risk it in order to do the right thing. So the suffragettes were hated in this country. Martin Luther King was the least popular man in America in 1961. Extinction Rebellion are not generally popular with the public, but they do know who we are, and we are changing the conversation. So we say we're not here to be popular. We'll make that sacrifice of not being liked if it will get the conversation to where it needs to be. So our theory of change is based on studies of social movements and revolutions throughout history. These studies demonstrate that when roughly 3.5% of a population becomes actively engaged in resistance, governments almost always come to the negotiating table. That's research by a woman called Erica Chenoweth, which I can say more about if anyone's interested at the end. And it's essential that our action is non-violent. And this is for moral but also strategic reasons. People respect non-violence. It cuts through other opinions that people have of what we do. It's also a demonstration of strength and confidence in the knowledge that what we're doing is right. Non-violence makes a strength of vulnerability. Like sitting in the road in front of a car when someone's screaming at you or threatening violence is not easy, but it's incredibly empowering, and it invites the same courage from others. So we have to draw out people's anger and resentment in order to communicate the gravity of the situation. To give you an example, like when the public sees ordinary people taking action like this, it forces people to ask themselves a question. Like, is the situation that serious that nurses and teachers and priests are willing to sit in the road and risk being arrested? So in a book written about Gandhi's campaigns for independence in India, the author says that radical social changes require an emotional crisis in the public. He writes that the humdrum of everyday human existence needs shaking up in order that we may arrive at fateful decisions. People are not going to really listen until they can feel, and our humdrum everyday existence is incredibly powerful in suppressing feelings and tranquilizing us and keeping our eyes and hearts closed. So in 2022, we're intending to mobilise hundreds of thousands of ordinary people. And our fight is with our government, and the tool is disruption. So many of these people will choose to take arrestable action, and some may even choose to do things that will mean they end up in prison. And I want to pause here, and I'm going to ask you to turn to the person next to you again, or form like a group of three, and just to talk through what it would mean for you to be arrested. And I'm not asking you to make any commitments or make any decisions, just what would that be like? Because it's not something many of us actually contemplate. So I'll just do that again, and we'll do 3 minutes again. If there's 3 of you, switch now. And if there's 2, you might want to switch now. Last person in the 3s. Okay, let's come back. Let's start again. Thanks. So I've been arrested, and I think there's probably other people in the room who can speak to that experience as well. So if people have got questions about it at the end, then happy to talk about what that's like. Surprisingly, I mean, it depends a lot on who you are and how the police treat you based on that, but surprisingly for me, one of the main things about it is that it's incredibly boring. A lot of waiting around. But arrest is far from the only role in Extinction Rebellion. There's teams like stewards, police liaison, artists who create our banners and artwork that make the protest beautiful, engineers, architects, arrest support, well-being. I think what makes us different and effective is that we focus on disruption and civil disobedience. But this requires like a huge amount of work behind the scenes that isn't those people who decide to get arrested. There's 10 others for each person who does that. And so, for instance, I've been working full-time for XR now for nearly 3 years, and I only took an arrestable action in November last year, but there was plenty of things to keep me busy before that. And what we're planning to do is engage a critical mass, 3.5% of the population, if that's what it takes. And that means millions of people supporting from home or getting involved online, hundreds of thousands on the streets and willing to sit in the road, tens of thousands willing to be arrested, and hundreds willing to go to prison. And this is how we win, and it started, but we do need you. Like, the decisions people here make will make a difference. And in April, we're going to be on the streets again in mass civil resistance. And in the build-up, we need all the help we can to mobilise. We're going to knock on every door, hold talks in every town, speak to everyone in order to grow in numbers. And things are changing. Recent survey that was done just after COP26 showed that climate is the top concern in the UK now, above COVID and the economy. And the UK now has the highest levels of concern of every country the UN polled, about 80 countries, I think, which I don't think is a coincidence that Extinction Rebellion started here and that we have those levels of concern. Not to say that we're the only factor. School strikes had a massive influence as well. So the UK could step up and be a world leader on this and make change. And people everywhere are desperate for moral and political leadership. And this fight is happening and we can win, but there is a lot of work to do, and it does take people like you getting involved and making that choice. So if you sit in a cafe and watch people walking down the high street, they don't look or sound ready for radical change. But that doesn't mean that they're not. All it means is no one's suggested it. No one's invited them. And people are angry and scared and burying their heads in consumption and escape, worrying about how to succeed or survive in a world that isn't offering any hope. And people are desperate for something meaningful to believe in. In the Soviet Union in 1989, people didn't look ready for a revolution, but then it happened. Revolutions are, by definition, explosive, just like the climate once it's reached a tipping point. We're in exceptional circumstances, so our response must be proportionate. If you were going to go on marches and sign petitions, then that is okay, but we do have to be honest with ourselves. They won't work, not in the time frame that we have now. And we don't have all the answers either. There's no guarantees. And if it makes you feel better, you can critique the plan and find all kinds of logical and practical problems with it. But critique is also inaction. And in the worst case scenario, we'll try and fail. And in the best case, it might turn out that an unprecedented scientific consensus, along with all our own empirical observations, were wrong. And then we just look a bit stupid. And that I can live with. What I can't live with is watching young people struggle and suffer through the years to come, watching more species continue to go extinct, and to know in my heart that I could have done something about it. So I just want to give a couple of minutes now to some people from the XR group here in Northampton just to say a bit about why they're here, why they do this, what it's been like over the last years or months that they've been involved. So I don't know, Bolt, who's going to do that?
Hi. From here or?
Stand up.
Hi. So my name's Marley. I grew up in Blackthorn. I am the youngest of 7 kids to a disabled single mother. I grew up in quite extreme poverty. And I was born in 1990, so it's really interesting finding out that half of all global emissions were released during my lifetime. Kind of crazy when you think about it. Nobody told me there was a crisis going on when I was growing up. I had no idea. I'd heard of global warming. I'd heard of issues with plastic or whatever in geography, GCSE. But I didn't realise that there was a crisis, that there was a legitimate existential threat to humanity and a million species with it until April 2019, when I was reading the news and I saw a picture of a man in his 80s, I believe, sat on top of a train eating a sandwich with a banner draped across the train that said, "Climate crisis, act now." And I thought, what on earth is going on that has put that man on top of that train? And so I read the article and I was like, well, this seems pretty crazy. So I looked into what was going on, and it completely rocked my world. And felt utterly betrayed by everyone and everything, because I didn't realise that this was such an issue. And it wasn't until that moment that I decided I needed to get involved. I hadn't been involved in any kind of activism or anything like that before. I'd only been involved in stuff through churches where I was helping out with food banks, and always had a passion for trying to help people who grew up on the kind of estates and in the kind of situation that I grew up in. I lived in a women's refuge for a portion of my childhood as well, and I just wanted to help people. And then I suddenly realised that this affects everyone, and more than anyone, it affects those people that are unaware of it. So I decided to come along to a meeting on the racecourse just down the road. Met some amazing people who are just normal people, because you always think that these movements are just a bunch of smelly hippies and climate crusties, as Boris Johnson said. But we're just normal people that have a genuine concern. And when I met these people, I just knew that these were the people I needed to be working with. So since then, I've given a lot of time to XR. I work self-employed, so I'm quite flexible with that, but given a lot of time to XR, and have attended a lot of actions. I've found myself arrested 4 times. I've never been convicted of a crime, because what I'm doing isn't illegal as it currently stands. And I fully and wholeheartedly believe that I'm doing the right thing. And that's why I would encourage anyone who has the capacity, a little bit of spare time, and the passion to do some good in the world, to sign up with XR and get involved. There's a place for everyone, any kind of background, any kind of skill set, any kind of involvement, from making the tea at meetings to physically sitting with us on roads, or whatever it takes. I absolutely encourage everyone to get involved. It's the best decision I made, but I'm 32 years old and I shouldn't be having to do it. And that's the most heartbreaking thing about it.
Did you want to say something?
Hi, I'm Paula. I'm much, much older than Marley. So I consider now, I realise how privileged I've been to be on the earth during the period that I've been on it. I would have not admitted it at all, but I know now I'm a very white, middle-class, privileged person. I grew up, lacking for nothing. I had a good education, lived on a farm for a while, reared horses, all that sort of thing. The most activist thing I ever got involved in was a march for the recognition of British Sign Language as a formal language. I work as a sign language interpreter. I do 80% of my work is legal, so I work in courts and police stations. I do a bit in education and mental health. So I began to realise how fortunate I am compared to people who don't have access to information. And then in 2019, I was visiting my 2-year-old grandson in Dorset, and I saw a march of XR, as it turned out. I was like, what's going on? And we took him to watch, and there were models of polar bears and banners, and all saying how these species were dying and they were becoming extinct. And that just got me interested, and it just really saddens me to think of so many young children will never see these animals, don't have that opportunity, because species are dying constantly because of what we've done to the planet. So so I went along and got involved in the local thing, and I've forgotten everything else I was going to say. Big preamble. And as Marley said, you can get involved in all sorts of different ways. There really are people from all walks of life, and sometimes I have to drop out for a while because it's all very disappointing and sad. You know, society is already beginning to break down with just really the minimal pressure of COVID compared to what's coming. And it's just so disappointing that we're not all working en masse. It would be nice to work globally to try and make the changes that need to be made. And I think that's all I can think of to say.
So I just have a little bit more, and then we can get to questions, which is much more interesting than me talking. But I'll just run you through the XR's demands, just so you have a sense of that. So we've made significant gains in achieving our first demand, on paper at least, when Parliament and councils around the country declared an emergency. And the demands have been carefully considered as part of a wider strategy. It's important that they're not too concrete or transactional, because what we're trying to do is change the conversation and change the public mood so that what seems politically impossible becomes the obvious choice. So our demands are that the government must tell the truth by declaring a climate and ecological emergency, working with other institutions to communicate the urgency for change. That the government must act now to halt biodiversity loss and reduce emissions to net zero by 2025. That the government must create a legally binding citizens' assembly on climate and ecological justice. So that means members of the public selected, a bit like a jury system, that are given all the information by experts, and then they bring their expertise in their lives and what daily life is like for a variety of people around the country, and they come to decisions about how our society should respond to the crisis. So in short, the demands are: let's stop doing what we know is killing us, and let's upgrade our democracy to include ordinary people to make the decisions that are going to affect all of our lives. And XR is a decentralised organisation, so that means anyone who operates under our principles and values, especially non-violence, can act under the banner of XR. But we do have groups of people who have working groups, and they have mandates to make decisions. So for example, there's a media and messaging team, which I'm part of, and they decide how to communicate and talk to the press and do social media, things like that. And then there'll be chances at the end of the talk to get more information and from people here in Northampton as well. So you're here because someone knocked on your door, most probably, and we've done a lot of research and spoken to experts in how movements grow. So people who worked with Bernie Sanders' campaign in the States are consulting with us on this. And we've come up with a really simple plan that will bring new people into the movement. And the basic idea is talking to people. And it doesn't sound that radical or that sophisticated, but when you think about it, when was the last time that you had a conversation with a stranger or with someone who reads a different newspaper to you, or you felt really listened to by someone from your community or a neighbour? And our lives become separated into these bubbles of people who are like us. And so to communicate and listen and meet people who are different to us becomes a radical act. So we start there with local people speaking to their neighbours about the climate crisis, inviting them to talks and then taking action together. And we work in sync across the country using these simple tools and methods that anyone can get involved with. And that means there's a role for everyone, and together we build momentum towards this action in April. And then we get on the streets in our thousands and demand change. So it's a bit like an election campaign in that it's fun and it's exciting and it's sociable. But it's different to election campaign because it doesn't end in April. We keep building until we have the numbers needed to force change. So that's the journey that you're being invited to join in on, really. And you'd be joining with some of the people in this room today and with thousands of others around the country. So this is our chance to be part of something big and in a very real sense to change the world. And it turns out changing the world can be as simple as knocking on doors and having conversations with your neighbours about what matters most in the world, making phone calls, helping us put on these talks. Because we're not going to get to 3.5% of the population on the streets unless we invite them. So that's what this is, an invitation. And it's what we're asking you to do, to share this invitation far and wide with everyone you know. So if you give contact details at the end, someone will call you and we'll figure out how you can help and, depending on what time you've got, what you can contribute. So just to finish, this is about so much more than saving polar bears. Like, of course, we want to save polar bears. But what I mean is that it's not just about doing our bit for the environment. It's about opening our eyes to the lie that we can go on like normal and not lose everything. And we're all complicit until we stand up and do something. And we can do something. Civil disobedience is what's needed now. And it's civil because we're committed to non-violence. And disobedience because to obey is to conform with a system that's killing us, that's taking us over the cliff edge. And if that sounds uncomfortable and scary, then you're feeling something, and that's good. It has to feel uncomfortable. And the first time I stepped out into the road and sat down with dozens of other people, knowing we were there together, I knew that I was alive and that I was doing something. And that moment changed my life. And so whether you take that physical step yourself or you support other people to do something similar, I want to invite you all to open your hearts and step out of your comfort zone and join us on this journey. So thank you very much.